Hi, my name is Matt Rozell. I'm a retired history teacher from upstate New York, and this is my presentation regarding my collection of World War II interviews that I did over the past 20 years, and one story in particular about a train near Magdeburg that was liberated by a tank battalion from the U.S. Army in the closing days of World War II, and what these soldiers found and what it led to 65, 70 years later. It's called The Train Near Magdeburg, and it's about the eyewitness accounts of the Holocaust and our World War II generation. A little about me. I am a retired history teacher, as I said. Graduated from the same high school I wound up teaching at. I'm currently writing my 9th book. I write World War II oral history. I'm also a United States Memorial Museum Teacher Fellow from 2008-2009. I've won a few awards. The Organization of American Historians in 2010 gave me their national award. I did a lot of extensive travel, awarded scholarships to study at the authentic sites of the Holocaust. My own state, New York, awarded me their highest award for the teaching of the Holocaust. And I studied in Jerusalem for 3 weeks, again, delving the deep dive into the Holocaust. So this is a story, bringing together the things that I learned. I did write a book about it. I was also named a righteous human being by the Greater Glens Falls community, Jewish community. In 2018, they gave me this nice granite stone to commemorate my achievements in bringing together survivors of the Holocaust with their American liberators. And it's in our village park. It's really nice with a tree. And no, I'm not buried under it yet. Okay, so this is me. Again, I started teaching in the late 80s, and this is some of my World War II cohort. I thought it was really important to spend more than the required 1 or 2 days in the history teaching of World War II. So in the late 80s, I would invite these veterans to come into the classroom. And one thing I found out was these veterans, they were ready to tell their stories. And I encouraged my students to take home these simple surveys that I made up. In fact, I bribed them with extra credit and said, have your grandfather or your grandmother, your parents even in some cases, fill in these sheets and get them back to me, and maybe we'll start to invite them in. And that's exactly what we did. So I'm going to flip through a couple of these sheets. I found them last night. I did a deep dive into my archives, and this is from probably late 1980s. This gentleman was 66 years old at the time. And as you know, our World War II generation is leaving us in droves. So this is at least 30 years ago. He was a machine gunner on Iwo Jima. Was combat scene, were you wounded? Yes, shot by a machine gun. Okay. Some more kept coming in. This gentleman was from the European Theater of Operations, and he was a medic, a surgical technician. And, he was 75 at the time. Was combat seen, were you wounded? Combat was seen. Our hospital was hit by German fighters, Me-109s, from Christmas Eve through the month of January 1945. So he's definitely talking about the Battle of the Bulge here. I had a question at the bottom. What does it feel like to know that you were part of a great historical epic, the defining event of our century? And he wrote, I'm glad that I was part of World War II. When the Japs bombed Pearl Harbor, everybody wanted to go. There weren't too many left in Hudson Falls, our town. We felt that it was our duty to fight for our country. So I got a few of these back. This gentleman was a machine gunner. Campaigns, North Africa, Normandy, Northern France, Rhineland, Ardennes, the Bulge, Central Europe. Was combat seen? Yes, he was wounded twice. Here's a man who was in the Pacific. Went to invade the Philippines, December. Was hit by a typhoon, lost 3 destroyers in the group we were with, lost 3 men from our ship, went ashore and everything was calm. Then the Japanese opened up with mortars from caves. What does it feel like to know you're a part of this event? It was a job to be done and we did it. Pretty common response. I ended with this question. What experiences or advice can you share with our young people of today to help make the Second World War more relevant? If you're ever called up for service during that time, do the best that you can to depend on each other. You have to survive. Survival was what it was about. Working together. Another one, war is not a gung-ho thing. War is hell. We lost almost half of our company, and we didn't see as much fighting as some of the other companies that lost most of their men. One company ended up with 17 out of 200 men left. We must live in peace. So they have a message for our young people. Was combat scene were you wounded? This man said, did not enter into combat because of the death of two brothers. The law stated that as I received a letter from Major General J. Ulio in Washington, D.C., and we've seen some of those telegrams, the death notices that were delivered to the families. He continues with this one, describe any memorable experiences. What is your situation like? Maybe it helped to find you today. He said, this experience I will never forget came when I was notified through the Red Cross of the death of my two brothers. I was stationed at Hickman Field in Hawaii. Here's another gentleman. At the conclusion of World War II, I thought this would be the war to end all wars. I was a little bit angry at first to find so many changes, such as unemployment and some veterans' benefits, and just a $250 bonus from New York. I never used the 5220 club, $20 a week for 52 weeks. Too proud. I think that this new generation is in for some hard times, too much alcohol and drug abuse. My prayers are for my grandchildren to get a good education and that they will never have to go to war. At the time of me being involved, partaking in some of the events of the time, it was a very hard time in my life. It was a very patriotic feeling at the same time as it is now. He continues, it is with my thoughts that a person, young or older person, of this great country of ours, the good old USA, should be so proud that they show it in their everyday life. The wars of this country, we have had many over the decades for the freedoms that many take for granted. Many of your young men have given their lives for us, that we can be free in this country. Thus, we should honor them in any way that we can. One of the kids wrote their grandfather's response. He felt he had a job to do, and he did it. He tries to forget it now. I like this one, succinct. Damn glad when it was over. And then finally, this is the one that struck me the most. I don't know how you could make the young people of today understand what it was like to go through a nightmare like a World War II. And that hit me because I don't know. I wasn't there. I was born 16 years after the war ended. But to go through a nightmare like a World War II, how do you make a person understand that? You really can't. But I took this as a challenge. So I set the kids out. We went into the community. We began to collect these oral histories while we could. The veterans many times came into the classroom. We had big assemblies in the school library where they would collectively or individually tell their stories. And they appreciated it. They made a bond with the younger generation that perhaps this bridge, besides their own grandchildren, they might not have had before. And there was a mutual appreciation, and it was beautiful. So I continued going on, doing these interviews, and one day in the summer of 2001, I was invited to go to a house. One of my students' grandfathers was in town for the summer. He was a retired New York State Supreme Court Justice. And he told me a story that would eventually wind up changing not only my life, but his life, the life of his American combat veteran friends, and the lives of the Holocaust survivors that he came upon on April 13th, 1945. And the interesting thing about this story, he almost didn't tell me the story. He was a tank commander in the 743rd Tank Battalion. I sat down with him to get his story from leaving law school in Albany, New York, to basic training, to shipping overseas, to being the quote-unquote lowest form of life, landing in Normandy in July of 1944, a bow gunner on one of the light tanks that were working with the infantry as they're pushing through the Battle of Normandy up into Belgium, the Battle of the Bulge, crossing the Siegfried Line, and then finally into Germany. So he told me 10 months of stories, and some were funny. He was a funny guy. His name was Red Walsh, Carol Red Walsh. He was 80 years old at the time, very spry. And we got to the end of our interview. It was 2 hours long. Great conversation with the man. And his daughter chimed in. She had been very quiet in the background. She said, "Dad, did you tell Mr. Rozell about that train?" And he said, "No, I didn't." So he started to tell me this story that would wind up changing probably thousands of lives at this point. So his friend, Red Walsh, he's on the right, and his other buddy with the pipe, with his arm around his shoulder, was George Gross, and they were both in the 743rd Tank Battalion. They both won battlefield commissions in those 10 months, so they each commanded their own light tanks. And in April 13th, 1945, the 743rd Tank Battalion, which was attached to the 30th Infantry, was pushing towards the Elbe River. They and their major were pulled out of the tank column. Somebody said there's a train stalled up by the tracks, and we need to figure out what's going on because there appear to be individuals, civilians, wandering around this train. The major's name was Clarence Benjamin. He was from Oakland, California. He jumped in the Jeep with his driver. He had these two tanks, Gross's tank and Walsh's tank, follow him on this scouting mission. They were on their way to fight a major battle at the city of Magdeburg, which would take place a couple of days later, one of the final battles in World War II, right on the Elbe River. The Soviets are coming in, the Red Army on the other side. The Americans are pushing through central Germany, but this train is in the way. So the major pulls up, he stands up in the Jeep, and he snaps his photograph for his after-action report. And you can see the drama in this photograph. So Walsh showed me the photograph, and he told me that I should get a hold of George Gross in California, still alive, retired professor, University of San Diego, because Gross had a camera too that day. There's the photo in the actual after-action report, which is buried in the National Archives. And this photograph remained buried until it was shown to me by Walsh and Gross. Several of the photographs that were taken by Dr. Gross, he gave me permission to put this story on our school website because by this time I was taking these interviews. The kids were helping me transcribe them, and we were putting them up on a World War II Living History Project page, which got 2 or 3 hits a day. And Dr. Gross wrote up this beautiful narrative of his remembrances. Now, his tank stayed with the train overnight. Walsh's tank was ordered to continue on. They had a battle to fight. And this is one of the reasons that Walsh actually, for him, it was just another day in combat, as you're going to hear from him later in this talk. And not to make light of it, he says, but so many things were happening. Don't forget, he almost forgot to tell me this story. So the photographs went up on our school website, and unbeknownst to me, at the Bergen-Belsen Memorial, Bergen-Belsen being the notorious concentration camp in northwest Germany, today there's a memorial there, which I visited. The gentleman there, the historians there, had found my photographs, and they were literally sharing these photographs that Dr. Gross gave me permission to put on our school website with survivors who were actually on that train. And out of the blue one day, I was actually given a test in my classroom. I think it was 2006. So this is 4 years after I put the stories up and the photographs. I got an email from a woman in Australia. You see her picture here, Lexi Keston. She was a 7-year-old girl that day on the train. And she said that when she saw the website and the photographs of the day of her liberation, her salvation, she fell off of her chair. She started to cry. She got on the phone and she found Dr. Gross, and I put her in touch with Kara Walsh. And today, Lexi and her family are close friends with the families of Walsh and Dr. Gross, who have since passed away. Well, I got really excited. In fact, I think I shed a tear or two sitting in front of my computer when the kids were taking their tests. When I got that email, I was in shock. Well, less than a month later, I heard from another survivor, and by the following fall, I had heard from 2 more. And these people were very, very highly educated professional men. On this train were probably 450 or 500 children. They were families that were in a special camp in Bergen-Belsen. Hence, you don't see the striped pajama type uniform, prison outfit. But I got thinking, I said, you know what? Walsh is right here. It's September 2007. I know 2 of the guys. One of them lives in New Jersey. The other one is a physicist down at Brooklyn College in New York City. And the man on the far left, Dr. Peter Lantos, was coming in to visit. He was a brain surgeon from King's College in London. So very highly educated men. And they came up to the high school. I arranged it so that they could meet their liberator. Now, I had a friend who worked at the Associated Press out of Albany, and he came up and he did a story. But before it went live, he said, Matt, I got to tell you, you better get your teachers ready, your secretaries ready, because I think this story is going to go viral. And this is in 2007. Viral meant a different thing back then. But he was right, because that's exactly what happened. So they met in our school auditorium for the first time. We had a lovely breakfast. Students were everywhere, invited to the breakfast. Obviously, they were in the audience listening to the testimony of all these men, 4 men. And they left and they went on their way. But we recorded everything. And the newspaper article, when it hit the wire, it got picked up all over the place. The next morning, which was a Friday, it was September 14th, 2007, I actually went shopping for a new computer at Staples. The salesman was trying to get me to buy a monitor to go with it. He pushed a button, the monitor flickered to life, and this was this home screen. And it was the front page news on the Yahoo news page, back when Yahoo was a thing. And lo and behold, there's Walsh. There's a picture the AP photographer took right in my classroom. And it did indeed go viral. It literally shut the servers down in the school over the weekend. I broke the internet. And by the end of that weekend, I had heard from 60 more survivors. I mean, this story went everywhere. Canada, United States, Israel. So over the course of the years that followed, we have heard from hundreds of Holocaust survivors who survived and went on to live because of these gentlemen. We hosted 3 reunions at our high school. 2007, the first one. 2009, ABC World News came up. We were their Persons of the Week. That was really cool. And we did a final one at the high school in 2011. We also did one in Israel, a big one, and we had 11 reunions overall. I became an official lay member, if you will, of the 30th Infantry Division Veterans of World War II Association. I met Frank Towers, the president, who happened to be the liaison officer between the 30th Infantry Division and the 743rd Tank Battalion. And Frank was actually the soldier, he was in his mid-20s, who was the man who took these people on Saturday, the 14th of April, 1945, and got them out of harm's way. There was an abandoned German Luftwaffe base at Hillersleben. It was actually a proving ground for some of their advanced weaponry, etc. There was hospitals there, there were barracks, there were German nurses, there were German doctors, and this is where the people stayed for 6 weeks to get healed up. The Russians wound up taking over this site at the end of the war. I wrote the book, A Train Near Magdeburg. It took me about 10 years, and it just all came together about this time in 2016. And I try to tell the story of the Holocaust, and that's part of the presentation today. The story of what the soldiers went through, their story, their end of it, fighting through, Normandy into Belgium, Battle of the Bulge, crossing over the Rhine River, and then this liberation scene. And then I write about the actual Liberation Day, and the book concludes with the liberators and the survivors meeting each other. We have a documentary in the works. It should be on PBS in spring 2022. So I knew I had to get this book out of me, but I had a lot of questions. For example, how many people were murdered in the Holocaust? You probably know that number if you're an educator like me. You think you know that number. But what does that number look like? Can you picture 6 million dead Jewish people? How many camps were there? That's a really good question, and it's an ongoing one, as you'll see in the next slide. Put it together now. Who's responsible for the biggest crime in the history of the world? How do you make 6 million people disappear in the course of 4.5 years? Was it Hitler alone? I think we know the answer to that, which raises more questions. How are the people on this train a snapshot of European Jewry persecuted by the Nazis and others? In other words, in researching this story, I found that most of the occupants of this train were from a particular exchange camp in Bergen-Belsen, and this camp was set up so that these Jews could be used as bargaining chips when the times got tough, and they were getting really tough in April 1945. They had certificates that indicated that foreign governments were interested in their well-being. So they were going to be used as bargaining chips. That was the plan. Can I make people care today about what happened nearly 3 generations ago? Oh, and I should add, while most of the people on the train were of Hungarian descent, we had Poles. We had people from the Netherlands who knew Anne Frank. We had people from all over Europe. There are Greek Jews on that train. Okay, they all have stories and they all fit into this big picture called the Holocaust. Okay, so we're collecting this testimony, but then you have to ask yourself, why is it important to listen to those people who were the first witnesses? What happens when these stories are no longer with us? And once people have absorbed the stories, do they have a moral responsibility to act on the lessons? Is there such a thing as being a witness when you yourself were not there? If you listen to this testimony, Elie Wiesel says yes. About 3 years before I finished the book, and 12 years after I met Judge Walsh, he's a retired New York State Supreme Court Justice, by the way, this article came out in the New York Times. The Holocaust just got more shocking. 42,500. Did you know that number? This is from an article that's 8.5 years old. The scholarship began right around the time that I interviewed Judge Walsh, and it's continuing to this day. The researchers cataloged some 42,500 Nazi ghettos and camps throughout Europe. The figure is so staggering that even fellow Holocaust survivors had to make sure they had heard it correctly. The new numbers are unbelievable. Now, that's a hard word, unbelievable, because some people say it never happened. This is not believable because it can't be true. It's so fantastic. Well, when you study the Holocaust, you realize how much you don't know. You might think you're an expert, but believe me, that changes. Bergen-Belsen was what one historian called the final stop, the terminus of the Holocaust. because by the time of 1945, the springtime, you have to remember the Americans are closing in on one side, the British and the Americans and the French, and the Soviets are closing in on the other. This map's from April 18th. So this map right here shows you some red dots, and the red dots are actually concentration camps. This is from a book from the late 1980s. There's probably 300 dots here. The bigger red are the bigger camps. Over in Poland in the east, you had the major killing centers. But Bergen-Belsen was where many of these prisoners from these other camps were being shipped to, just stay out of the way of the advancing Allied armies. So by the time the British liberated the camp on April 15th, this train transport had left the week before, they found 60,000 people here. 10,000 were dead. 800 died the day the British 11th Armored Division entered Bergen-Belsen camp. 800 people who got to see their liberators and died. Another 13,000 have since died. This billboard type thing was put up in the camp in probably about 2 or 3 weeks after the British came in. So it's quite an experience to visit there. This is the first monument that was put up by the Jewish community. I went there with a bunch of teachers in 2013. We were studying the Holocaust, and this particular trip was set up originally by survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto, and they actually took us to Bergen-Belsen first. So I got to see all this. Here's a photograph, because you have to remember, when the camp was liberated, these people had nowhere to go, number one. Number two, no country wanted them. So many of them stayed in Bergen-Belsen as a displaced person. It became a whole different thing after that. For 5 years, some of my friends were here. Children who spent their teenage years in Bergen-Belsen waiting to come to Canada, the United States, or Australia. So here are some of the people who died then. It's a very peaceful place today. It's very beautiful. Here's our class. We're out walking in nature, it would seem, like it's a park stroll. But this is the scene in the woods in April 1945, taken by the British. This is what the British soldiers walked into. And this is what the survivors of the train near Magdeburg were leaving. Another shot. This is a compound near what was called the Women's Barracks. Here's a shot from probably a week after liberation, 1945. These pictures were taken by the British Army. Another photograph, probably about the same place that this was photographed back in 1945. Pretty graphic. And I don't show these slides lightly. With students, you have to be judicious, even the older ones. So they get a quick scroll sometimes. This is me walking through the woods. You see a gutter channel running towards the latrine. Same photograph in 1945. This guy expired shortly after the photograph was taken. You may know her. You definitely know her sister. Okay, it's Margot and Anne Frank. Did you know that they died in Bergen-Belsen? Yes, they were shipped to Auschwitz after the discovery from the Netherlands to a camp in the Netherlands and then to Auschwitz in the fall of 1944. But then they wound up in Bergen-Belsen, where they probably died. Well, we know they died, but we don't know exactly when. They were sick. March, February 1945, only a few weeks before the camp was liberated. This particular monument says, "Here lies 800 dead." This may be where those two beautiful girls wound up. It's a cemetery. And these are mass graves. Here lies 1,000 dead, April 1945, all over the grounds of the Bergen-Belsen Memorial today. So pretty graphic. And a lot of the people obviously died from starvation and disease. Typhus was raging through the camp. It probably killed the Frank girls. Some of the train occupants were typhus victims themselves. Not a pleasant way to go. The British burnt the camp to the ground in the middle of May, about a month after liberation, mainly to combat the spread of this typhus disease. So today it's not there. You have to use your imagination, but the photographs help. This man is the keeper of the Book of Names, Burned Horseman, at the Bergen-Belsen Memorial. He contacted me, and you can see the photographs in the lower corner that they found on our school website. And then they talk about the train transports, okay? So the trains, these 3 transports with the people who had exchanged papers left the camp in April 6th, I believe the first train left, followed by another 2 in the next couple of days. They were headed to the camp that's circled in the blue at the bottom of this map called Theresienstadt, which is actually the last concentration camp that was liberated. It was liberated by the Russians on the last day of World War II, May 8th. So they were trying to get these people out so that they could do something with them. And they wound up deciding to execute them in the end. So here's the route of the 3 trains. The train that was liberated by the Americans on April 13th that Walsh and Gross were a part of was liberated at a place called Farsleben. The blue line is the Elbe River. The yellow line is the route of that train, but there were 2 others that were liberated as well. So the first one was liberated by the Americans. The second one actually made it to Theresienstadt. We're not sure exactly what happened to the people. The third one was liberated by the Russians across the river on the 23rd. Here's my friend Steve Barry and his liberator, Judge Walsh, Carol Walsh. And this is when they met for the first time in Florida. I heard from Steve in that weekend after we did our very first reunion. He said he was eating a bagel, drinking a cup of coffee. He opened up the newspaper and he spit his food out. And he said, "This is the train I've been looking for the last 60 years." They found out that they lived about an hour away from each other in Florida. So there was a reunion that was arranged. I'm going to give you a link. You can watch the video of their reunion. They describe the scene of liberation from their own perspectives. The letter that you hear at the end that Judge Walsh wrote to Steve Barry is in the archives of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I did a presentation there. The director herself, Sarah Bloomfield, stood up and asked if they could get that letter, and the 2 gentlemen agreed to it. So it's very significant for them, where he says, "You don't owe us anything. We owe you everything for everything that was done to you when the world did nothing about it." Frank Towers, the man on the left, sitting next to Frank Jr., his son, a Vietnam veteran, is greeting Ariela Rojic, the little Polish girl who was 11 years old, she's like my mom. She lives in Toronto, Canada, and boy, they hit it off. Frank hit it off with everybody. This is Frank in Jerusalem. Actually, it's in Rehovot, between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, where we got to meet. You look at the expression on these 2 girls' faces. They were on the train. He got to meet 55 survivors and about 500 descendants who probably wouldn't have been alive if it hadn't been for Frank, the 30th Infantry Division, and the 743rd Tank Battalion. That was a great, great time. Leslie Mizels from Toronto, 17-year-old Hungarian boy. This is with his precocious granddaughter, who he called his revenge. Just loved to meet his liberators. My beauty, she was 4. She was an orphan. She was raised by other women. And she had a great story. And I visited her in Israel a few times. And she just recently passed away. Leslie's gone. Steve's gone. Ariela's still alive, though. There's a cute little girl. When 2011 came around and we did our last reunion, it was kind of hard to get people to come because they're not really young people anymore. And the phone rang in my classroom. I mean, my school put a phone in the classroom that had an outside line, which is kind of unusual at the time, because the secretaries are fielding calls from all over the world for a while, from survivors and soldiers who are looking for me. I hadn't heard from anybody in 4 years, though. The phone rang in the middle of the lesson. I picked it up, during my break time. And it was this man, Walter Gantz. And he said, Matt, I was a combat medic. I was at Hillersleben for 6 weeks. I took care of these people. The soldiers went off and fought their battles. I stayed. And he had a pretty dramatic story. And I don't know if you ever heard of this guy, but he was a guest of the president in 2019, the State of the Union address. He survived the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. He was in the parking lot when the gunman came out. In other words, he was late, and many of his friends died. So I read the story in the Washington Post about how he narrowly survived, and of course they made a big deal about the fact that he was a Holocaust survivor who had been saved before, and they started to talk about this train, liberated by Americans. Sure enough, Judah was on that train. So we arranged, the film producer, Mike Edwards, and I, for Judah and Walter to meet in Scranton, Pennsylvania, Walter's hometown. And I'll show you that quick clip, which is going to be in our film.
It's a long time ago, over 70 years. It's a lifetime. And sadly, with time, your memories become dimmed, You just can't. But there are certain events that will stay with a person all their lifetime.
I remember that the train stopped in the middle of a forest, and everybody panicked. Everybody felt that this is the place where they're going to come and kill us all. And sure enough, we heard a rumble of a tank, and then the turret opened, and a soldier popped out, and my father yelled, "Americans."
The response to seeing that star on the green painted tank and Jeep is one of unbridled joy for those survivors who were not too young to understand what it meant. It meant liberation. It meant that they were now saved. I'm going to have you go ahead of me a little bit. Walter's at the table. Just go sit down
Right
next
here?
to him. Yep. There he is.
There is my friend. Maybe my savior. So good to see you.
I never dreamt that this would happen someday.
Well, it happened thanks to
but life is.
thanks to a couple great gentlemen.
Yeah. Here's our
guys.
Here's our good
Hi.
friend.
How are
Here's
you?
our good
Yeah,
friend.
he's the one
Group hug, group hug.
he's the one who united us.
Yeah, I know.
That's right.
So that was a pretty great moment. And a week later, Walter came to one of my talks in Pennsylvania, and he met another survivor from Brooklyn. It was beautiful. He died the following November, and he was 95. He said he read my book 4 or 5 times. There's a chapter about him in it. And he said, I'm not reading it because I'm in it. I'm reading it because I want to learn more about the Holocaust. His family put the book in his coffin, and he was buried with it. So that's the end of my story for now. I do have several books, and it's all World War II oral history testimony. And if you're interested, you can go to my website, MatthewRozellBooks.com. But look for us on PBS. And I know you probably have some questions, and I probably went a little too fast, but here we are. And if you have any other questions, just feel free to ask.